Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is the top 10 of 2022. 2022 has been quite a year on the show. The most wide range of topics in the first full year that this show has been a weekly publishing show. We made that transition somewhere mid-2021, and ever since then, the show has really grown. Topics ranging from still only one COVID episode in 2022, which was really exciting, and I'm really glad that that actually did not make the list, but tons and tons of topics related to our profession, the education field in general, society, current events, politics. We really touched everything. In this episode, I'm going to clip out and share some highlights of the episodes that you thought were the best. And I determined that by total downloads and also speed of those initial downloads. There's different ways to rank that. Obviously, if we're doing a year in review, the ones from the beginning of the year would have an advantage. So I tried to create a system that would balance that. So here's what we came up with. As always, throughout the whole year, this show has been supported through an affiliation with SightReadingFactory.com, where you enter your Choralosophy checkout code and get a discount, and it helps me as well. In addition, we have affiliations with MyMusicFolders.com, GraphitePublishing.com, and RyanMain.com. Entering Choralosophy at checkout at all of those websites saves you and helps me. Coming in at number 1, and one of the most popular episodes in the history of the show, is episode 90, Sound Before Sight, with Dr. Carol Krieger. This episode blew up and is continuing to blow up as one of the most useful and, in a lot of ways, provocative and controversial episodes in my catalog. So be sure to check it out. Here's a clip. Yep.
And we can catch them up by going back and filling in those gaps. And so whose fault is it? It's been doing this for a long time, unfortunately. And I think it's up to a few people like us and hopefully others that join in that say, I want my kids to read. I don't want to have to be banging the piano the rest of my life. I want them to go sit under a tree and figure it out. I want them to really be able to compose because they hear it and audiate. Could I said, we should be teaching our students like we adults do with reading a book. We should teach them to open up their score, silently read it, audiate the whole thing. You step to the podium, raise your hand, give the downbeat, and you have instant sound. That doesn't happen. And even
it happens in my classroom.
Okay, but you said they have to work at getting those skills.
Yes.
So when they walk in your room, you're giving them those basic skills.
Yes, it eventually happens.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Thank God you're doing that.
Yeah.
But you realize how many don't.
Right.
And so I guess for me, I just want my kids to love music. And the more they understand it, the more they hear it, the more they audiate it, the more they can improv with it, the more they own it, and the more they want to do it. Whether they major in music or not, I could care less. But I want them to walk out with literacy skills. I read books all the time. I love reading books. And I could only imagine to have kids reading at their level. You hand it out. Each kid is already hearing in their head where the most important apex of the phrase is. They're already seeing where that passing tone is going. They hear the chord structure linearly at their level, be it a 6th grade level, an 8th grade level, a 9th grade level. And then I step to the podium and we all put our stuff into that basket.
Right.
And the whole becomes greater than the individual.
And you know what I think happens? Because I agree. I think that's incredibly important. I think sometimes what happens, and you might, I think you alluded to this earlier. Some people would be listening to this and they would start to bristle even at this conversation, because I think what ultimately is going on is that they're hearing, well, that's not how I was taught. And I revere my music teacher. And since my music teacher was, in my mind, was a giant, well, doing it this way, they're implying that this way is better, and that this way is, and that hurts me because the way I grew up doing it is very special to me.
Okay.
And I think there's actually an emotional connection to it.
Well, of course there is, but here's what I would say back to you. Would you go to a brain surgeon who the last class he had was 1950? Or would you go to a brain surgeon whose last class was 2020?
Of course.
Things change. We now know more things about how we learn. I love my teachers, but I also know that's what they knew at that point.
Yep.
We know so much more now. So for me to bury my head and say that is really selling my own students short and selling me staying abreast of what we now know.
Yep.
And I don't think my teacher would say, no, Carol, stay doing this 1965 methodology. I think my teachers would say, Carol, go for the gusto and make it grow, because they grew from what they were given. And I'd like to think that I'm growing from what I got. And I'd like to think that my students are going to go on to find all kinds of new ways and things, that I'm not the end all and be all. I tell every workshop, you better check back in with me in 3 to 5 years, because what I told you may have changed.
Yeah.
And
somebody figured out a better way.
Yes.
Yep.
And if we as educators aren't doing that, and we're staying in the old way because I have such a tie and I'm so comfortable, oh, my kids are missing out.
Mm-hmm.
My kids are missing out greatly. I mean, just this summer, I had students sitting there that I had in high school. I had students sitting in there that I had in college. I had students sitting in there that I had as graduate students. And I had to turn to the high school one and say, oh, honey, I have learned so much since you had me back in 1997. So hang on to your hat, because we're moving. Mm-hmm. And then I'd have to say to the college kid, yep, Mama Kay finally got brave and added in all kinds of new things, found other ways to deal with it. And yes, I'm teaching improv now. Applause for Dr. K. And then you go to the grad student and say, hey, new things. I know you graduated 3 years ago with me, but I've learned more.
Yeah.
Isn't that what we want from every teacher?
It should be what we want from every day of our life.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and let the record show, because I have a lot of former students who are now music teachers and or music ed students, because I'm old, and if any of them are listening, I want you to go into your classrooms someday and teach way better than I did.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
And that would make me incredibly proud, not threatened. I would feel incredibly proud, because I gave you the building blocks that I learned. Mm-hmm. And that I built on, so that you can build on more. That's the philosophy.
It should be, absolutely. Mm-hmm. You know, if it isn't, then we should go back to just having hammers and no electrical tools.
Well, number 2 on my list is a more recent episode. It's episode 128, The Strange Relationship Between Choral Music Ed and Vocal Ped, with Dr. Sharon Hansen. This episode also very quickly burst out onto my podcast. This episode very quickly exploded and is continuing to be shared just left and right constantly. Every time I check my phone, this episode is being shared again by somebody. And again, very useful episode, but also a little bit controversial. These top 2 episodes are, not surprisingly, huge gaps in our profession that the conventions don't talk about. It's hard to get professional development on these topics. And we've been asking why this year in 2022, and you've been responding. That choir directors oftentimes are the only voice teacher that a lot of students have. Why does that matter, that we know what we're talking about when we talk about singing?
I know that is a kind of a funny question, isn't it? Would we ask that same question of our band and orchestral colleagues? Why would it matter that they know how to pull a stuck trumpet valve, or know how to put a vocal in a bassoon, or know how to put a new string on a string instrument? Our voice, we're not an instrument exterior. Our instrument is interior. And boy, we really need to know at least the basics about how to deal with the instruments that are sitting in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
And, this whole fear thing, I'm afraid every day I stand up in front of a choir and warm them up, and I'm afraid I'm going to say something stupid. I'm not a voice teacher. I'm just a choir director who's spent a long time trying to figure this out, but nonetheless, I still have that fear. But on the other hand, that should not be an excuse for doing nothing.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I think if our foundation of understanding of how the voice works starts with, at the very least, like you said, the basics of understanding how resonance works, understanding the importance of vowels, all of those things, well, I'll just take it into my classroom again. If I am teaching my kids about correct and incorrect ways to sing, one of the things that I'm very, very explicit about is I add the caveat for this style.
Yes. Fantastic.
We don't talk about this. There is a correct way to sing, period. We talk about how in this style, the correct way to sing is this type of resonance or this type of vowel, or from this language, we wouldn't use this ah vowel, we'd use this other more darker ah vowel, or whatever it is. And we would talk about in the context that the music exists. But the problem is, if you don't understand how to explain the body parts and what they're doing to the kids, then it makes it difficult to teach it.
Absolutely. Well, it's like if we were just focusing on classical music, it would be the same problem. In this style, in this Baroque style, we make these articulations and we use this tone production. In Renaissance style, so why is it any difference knowing about performance practice and style for vocal jazz or rock or musical theater or whatever it happens to be?
At number 3 is episode 112. This was a live presentation that I did at Alabama ACDA. It's called Arts of Personhood and Shining Eyes. It's a live presentation, has some question and answer. The video version is really good. I think this one resonated with people because it's more of a, why do we do this job? And in what way do I hold myself responsible for the outcomes that I have as an educator? And I think in 2022, this might have resonated because the trend is to talk about why things suck in education and why it's not our fault. This episode was me saying that it's your fault, but in a nice way. So check it out. Filtering, which is defined here as focusing on the negative while ignoring the positive. Catastrophizing, which is expecting the worst case scenario and again, minimizing the positive. Polarized thinking, which is all or nothing thinking that ignores complexity. It's either good, it's evil. Heaven's reward fallacy, expecting self-sacrifice in order to get a reward. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple for time. Some of these I want you to think about how often you see these exhibited on Facebook. Global labeling, which is the extreme generalization of people, places, and things. All the shoulds. We hold tight to personal rules of behavior and judges the self and others if rules are broken. Another way you could put that is purity culture. Okay. Another one, always being right. Being wrong is unacceptable. Being right supersedes everything. So I mentioned before, the turning the mirror on ourselves. I told the story about how I was going to impress everyone. That one was mine. I needed to be right. I still enjoy being right. Okay, but I actually get more benefit now because I've reflected. I get more benefit out of the learning so that I can be right next time. I can see that that's something I had to grow to do. I become happier by shedding that mental distortion. Here's another one. Overgeneralization assumes a rule from one experience. So you've had one experience with a thing, and now you just assume that that's always going to be the case, that negative thing that happened. Right? So what's the value here of recognizing these what he calls mental distortions? This is more of Jonathan Haidt's stuff. Okay? So the cognitive distortions, if we don't reflect on our use of them, because these are things that everybody does, by the way. Everybody does these things. But the more aware of what we're doing that we can be, the more likely we are to engage with the world as it is and not as the little the image of like the demon on one shoulder with the angel on the other shoulder, that's like one's telling you a good thing and the other's telling you a bad thing. It's kind of like that. It's like, how much time do we spend listening to that bad little demon telling us all these horrible things? The reason I chose to bring up Facebook with this is because social media actually is designed to reward all of those behaviors. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That is what they say. It's the Netflix documentary thank you, Social Dilemma. Social Dilemma, made by one of the folks who was involved in the creating of some of those early social media algorithms. They flat out hired a team of psychologists to figure out how to design a platform to make sure that people would be doing those things as much as possible. Okay? It is not a coincidence that then teachers go on teacher Facebook groups and engage in all those behaviors and then take that negativity back into their classrooms. Okay? These types of behaviors are cognitive distortions, and the faster you can spot them, the faster you can exist in social media without being dragged into it. It's like, oh, I recognize that it's trying to get me to overgeneralize here, or it's trying to get me to catastrophize here, or whatever, and then we can start to fight those things in ourselves. And I promise you, the you that you bring into your classroom starts to become a happier, more well-adjusted you. Your spirit emanates from you to your students. It is addictive. It is addictive. Have fun. Go on vacations. Get a hobby. And this kind of ties back into the cognitive distortions I read earlier. Look for the best things about the world and talk to your students about them. Are we encouraged to do that in our current culture? No, we are not. It's a crime. Coming in at number 4, we have the Chanticleer, episode 121. This was an exciting project of engineering for me, where I drove to Lawrence from my home in Kansas City, about an hour, brought all my cameras and microphones, and tried to set up a live recording with the entire ensemble of Chanticleer. This one also was visually a little bit more interesting on YouTube. It had a huge YouTube resurgence for me, which my YouTube channel is not a big part of what I do, but a lot of people do enjoy the videos there. And this one, because there was so much to look at, was really popular on YouTube, but it was also a really interesting conversation.
I've been in Chanticleer for a long time, and this is one thing that I think, we were still kind of like, well, how do we maneuver, like, the fact that we're not really a choir, we're not really, we are, and we're also a chamber group, and so we need some direction, but we also need to be collaborative, and we also need to be self-sufficient. But it's like we kind of exist with 12 people. It's a little, sometimes can be a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and so it's over the years. It's just like that's kind of the one thing that is sort of the thing that we kind of have to like always in every piece we rehearse, kind of get around like the sort of existing between the choral and the chamber aspect of music making. And, but I mean, I think it makes it interesting, fascinating, and challenging. So I wouldn't change a thing, really.
A distinct issue of being an unconnected ensemble is that you have to talk in advance about a lot of decisions that a conductor can make in the moment or communicate in the moment of performance.
Number 5 on the list was episode 88, Music is Inherently Raceless, with Theron Jenkins. Maybe not surprisingly to anyone else, another controversial episode. We had a lot of response to this one, probably with the problematic title. Not apologizing. It is exactly what we meant to say, and if you listen to that episode, you will understand what we mean by that title. But this episode was really exciting for me because it was one of those episodes that came about from somebody who'd been listening to the show who had written in with some really interesting comments over the time he'd been listening, and we turned it into an episode, very organic, something that I think is really kind of highlights the purpose of this show in many ways, is just to continue the conversation. I always talk about, I want you to join the conversation. Theron did that, and we turned on the microphone and recorded it. It was wonderful.
There are many aspects to my personality that you can explore I think, very constructively. But you sit here and ask me such one-dimensional questions about a very tiny area of our lives. You ask me questions that fall continually within the Negro-ness of my life. You ask me questions that pertain to the narrow scope of the summer riots. I am artist, man, American, contemporary. I am an awful lot of things, so I wish you would pay me the respect due and not simply ask me about those things.
Thoughts?
Ooh, yeah, that is I feel like there's a lot of people that I think can echo a lot of those particular thoughts, especially the idea that I am a lot of things. Like I am a like even like just me personally, I'm a father and I'm a husband, I'm a teacher, I'm a brother. Like I am so many things that matter not just to me, but matter to other people and my role in those things. Are they informed by who I am in terms of my ethnic makeup? Yeah, absolutely. Like they're definitely informed by that. But to us to be reductionist is to be reductionist about any person based on anything is to rule out all of the other beautiful parts of what we are. And
Mm-hmm.
it's to watch, one of the greatest American actors of all time be frustrated that why are you like of all the things you could ask me about, why are you only asking me about these things? Like if that's how we're going to look at one another, if that's how I'm going to look at a student that walks into my room who, I haven't had the chance to teach yet, if I just make blanket assumptions about what I think they can or cannot do,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm only going to teach part of that kid. I'm not going to teach that whole child. And that's a disservice. It's a really disservice to young people and to people in general to just be reductionist about who we are.
And it teaches them to also reduce themselves
Exactly.
going forward. And that clip was I was fighting back tears the first time I saw that because again it's from the sense of empathy that I feel for how angry I would feel if I was being put in a box like that, and that's kind of what bothers me about it, because I was imagining him hearing questions in a news conference and probably on a deep, artistic level, because you and I are both artists and not actors, but I don't know, maybe you're an actor. I'm not.
Not a good.
Okay. But I'm thinking like maybe he was thinking, why aren't you asking me about questions about the acting choice that I made in that most recent film? Like, why did I choose to pause and look up at that one moment? Or why aren't you asking me like artistic questions, because we're here to talk about art? And then I start empathizing as a conductor. If I'm talking to a black conductor, and maybe he's in that same situation, or she, and thinking, why aren't you asking me why I phrased that differently than the Robert Shaw recording? Or I reached outside of the choral profession into the education research expertise world to talk to Dr. Christina Mitchell about how your school's PD that they make you do is not evidence-based. Well, you might say, well, how does she know? And the main answer is, and she'll make the case in this episode, in episode 95, go back and check it out, that there aren't any. We are horrible in education at collecting evidence for best practices for teaching. And she talks to us about how we should think about that and what the best way forward is.
Well, my favorite example is the one that I personally have published an article on, and that is the use of learning objectives in the classroom. So anybody who follows my TikTok is going to know that I come back to this very regularly. So we're often told, sometimes mandated as educators, you need to use learning objectives. They need to be worded in a specific way. You're going to use Bloom's taxonomy. You're going to put them on the board or in your syllabus. You need to reference them throughout your teaching, and that will improve your students' learning. So that's the idea. It's going to make your teaching better, and it's going to make the students learn more. And I think a lot of times as educators, we're like, that seems silly. Like, I'm not saying we should walk into class with no idea what we're going to teach, even though I've done that. And I know you've done that. We've all done that. But, it's good enough for me to know today I'm going to teach about asking a good research question. That's enough. I don't need a learning objective written in a certain way. Yet as educators, we're expected and required to do that. The research that's based on is not really well done. Most of it's not done in a quasi-experimental or experimental way. So my colleague and I, we heard this mandate that we have to use learning objectives, and we thought we can test this. So what we did is we looked at different sections of the same class. So the same class, we were teaching 3 different iterations of it. In one of those classes, we did just what the administrators wanted us to do. We wrote the learning objectives the right way. We referenced them in class. We talked about them. We made sure the students knew about them. Then in the second version, we wrote them and we had them available for students, but we never intentionally called them out.
Right.
And in the third class, we did the kind of learning objective that I would rather use, which is like, today we're going to learn about, research design. And that was it. There was no intentional way of wording the learning objectives, writing them. We only used it in our normal way as educators, that we would talk about what we're going to learn. And at the end, we asked the students in each of those 3 courses, how did you feel about the learning objectives? Did you use them? Did you read them? Do you think learning objectives are helpful? So that was one question, to see, does presenting them differently result in something different from our students' perceptions? And we found no, there was no statistically significant difference across the 3 sections. But then, of course, maybe they learn better if we use learning objectives in a different way. So we looked at what are their final exam scores, what are their scores in the course overall, to see, is this improving student performance in the class? And once again, no, there was no statistically significant difference in our students' perceptions or in their performance.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm trying to, the whole time you were explaining that, I was thinking about, as a music teacher, the way we deliver instruction is different, and a lot of times doesn't fit into the box that these new programs fall into. But in terms of learning objectives, I have taught for several years in a school. We're no longer being forced to do it, but for many years we were. We were expected to write them on the board, and just like you said, they need to be phrased a certain way, and they need to be there's all kinds of worksheets we did in our PD to make sure that they were written correctly. And then they had to be on display in the room all the time. Okay. But I think back to my time teaching, and I think of the best class periods that stick out in my mind of the most effective instruction that I've ever delivered were the kinds when I was simply like kind of using your example of just having a general direction that I wanted to go with the class, and then responding to the students in the moment to figure out what the objectives were in the moment. Because I'm looking at their eyes. I'm looking to see when they're confused and when they kind of smile a little bit to indicate that they've got it. And I'm like playing them like a joystick. And that's when, to me, that's when education is the most exciting, is when I don't know what the objective will be until we're doing it. And that's a pretty cool thing. And so I think, in fact, just a funny story, I had a colleague that was not happy about that policy of always displaying their learning objectives. I wasn't happy either. I just didn't really care. But he decided the administrator was going to come in and observe to make sure that they were there. And his learning objective was suck less. That's it.
That's a learning objective.
Yeah. But of course the administrator was not happy, and he just goes, well, I just figure it'll work today, and that same one will work again tomorrow.
Yep.
Like, all right. So can you think of any others? Are there any other that fall outside of your area of research that people just assume is true? Another Splash Award episode where I put these as a pair because really it was one big long episode. Number 7 on my list is Robin Hilger's episode 130 and 131. I, again, drove in person to Oklahoma City this time to set up shop and record a very long conversation. I gave you just the juiciest bits with ACDA Executive Director Robin Hilger. We talked about the gamut of things that tend to be sticking points for ACDA members and choir directors in general. I got her take on all of it. So check those episodes out. Here's a little clip. everybody who listens to my show regularly already knows that I'm also very opinionated, and I have a lot of beefs with a lot of things about a lot of the ways people talk about things.
Contrarian.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Me too.
And partly because I see value in that, like that every ecosystem needs to have somebody like that. Okay, because if all we ever have are people around us who say "good job, way to go," then we're not. We're going to miss all kinds of things that we never would have had pointed out to us. And so, to me, that's part of the diversity conversation. Is also, well, it's the idea that opinions don't have skin colors and opinions don't have genders. Right? It's the idea, like there's a lot of part of the diversity conversation is also perspective. It's also type of life experience. It's upbringing. It's religious upbringing versus a secular upbringing. There's all kinds of things, and again, because it kind of goes back to my comment earlier, where humans can't be put into a spreadsheet, and we miss a lot when we look at each other as boxes that we can check. And I, like I said before, I do acknowledge that there is a need to know certain demographic information about things, or else you don't know a bigger picture. But then at the same time, I think a lot of times people have trouble taking off their spreadsheet glasses and putting on their higher resolution lenses, where they're starting to see how truly kaleidoscopic diversity really is. And so, like, for example, I've had a lot of conversations just about the idea that there is more than one way to be against racism, for example. There's more than one way to we were talking about this before, more than one way to approach a diversity problem in performing choirs. One way to talk about it would be admission to music schools. One way to talk about it would be what's going on with elementary school education at the foundation. Right? There's more than one way to approach all of these things, and I think I think in order for a conversation to really be able to claim that it's a conversation about diversity, there has to be that has to be present. And then, of course, we get into the things you've said before, which is that there's only so many hours in the day, and there's only so many things that we can talk about, right? And so one of the things that I think about a lot too with ACDA is that we, because all those things are true, you know, there's I'll throw out some examples just to make it really concrete what I'm talking about. One of my many really controversial opinions is that I'm part of what a philosophical movement, I guess you could say, which would be into making sure that we are very conscious and careful with the way we think about these categorizations of ourselves. Is like if I'm going to talk about race, for example, I'm usually going to use terms like racialized as white, or racialized as black, because race doesn't exist. It's a social construct. And because I recognize things like the way, well, even things, I'll just tell you a story, a short one. I have a bunch of students in my school are what we are, they would check the box black, but they're Nigerian, from Cameroon, a lot of African immigrants, first generation, or their parents were born there or moved here. So like it's a pretty robust Ethiopian students in my school, a lot of them. And when they get to the U.S., they're asked to check the box black, but they're not black. Like in their conceptualization of who they are and what they are, they're Nigerian or they're Ethiopian, or that's how they conceive of themselves. Another good example would be like, this is a common trope in somebody from the Dominican doesn't find out they're black till they get here. This happens all over the place, and I sometimes worry that we as musicians, we should know this better than anybody, and sometimes I feel like we don't. And I think it's an American thing. It's a very uniquely American thing. But if on a rubric for, like, say, application to a convention, we're doing all kinds of math about, like, the diversity of our programs that we're putting forward. But then we're checking boxes like, based on skin color and gender and all these other things that don't necessarily make our programs sound or look different. And it's kind of a really heady way to think about it. But I like to think about it this way: if I have a choral program written, and I've got composers that are maybe they could run the gamut of melanin shades, but they theoretically could all be culturally the same because they came from the same part of the country and went to the same schools and were educated in the same places. But I could have checked the boxes successfully on the rubric, and then ended up with a program of people who pretty much all come from the same place. And again, that kind of plays into the whole idea of the uniquely weird way we think about this in the U.S.
Well, yeah, completely ignoring intersectionality. That's what you're talking about.
Yes, in some ways, yes. Yeah. In some ways, yes. Mm-hmm. And of course, in fact, I'm glad you brought up intersectionality as a concept, because that's a really good way to kind of understand this. But I also sometimes feel like we misuse even that concept. And coming in at number 8 is episode 93, Togetherness Activists, with Micah Hendler. Micah is a director of the Jerusalem Youth Chorus, which is at the epicenter of the places in the world that we would think that the divisions are just too deep for us to stand in a room together and make music. Because, as we talk about in this episode, there are times where bombs are going off. There is violent interactions between communities in this part of the world, and yet Micah is doing remarkable things, bringing people together through music. This episode is one of my favorites, and if you missed it, I strongly recommend you checking this one out.
That's a question that I ask myself a lot, particularly with the Jerusalem Youth Chorus, but also with the work in the U.S., is like, to what end? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I think just getting people together to talk and understand one another is good. But then ultimately, what is the message that you're sending? And what are the ways in which the situation of that message and of that work can either help or hurt on other levels? Either the singers or like the causes, or just by, one of the main criticisms of work that brings Israeli and Palestinian anybody's together to do anything is the idea of like normalization, is the idea that somehow just by getting people together, even if they're coming together in a frame that is fundamentally trying to challenge the status quo, that reinforces the status quo by being sort of a fig leaf for broader injustice that's happening and the sort of inequality that is inherently brought to any interaction like that. And the idea then of sort of like, if we as the Jerusalem Youth Chorus were willing to just like sing, beautiful, hopeful songs at like in any context, would that really be helpful? Because there's so many people who want to twist the music that we make into a propaganda tool for things that we don't believe in. And I could give you examples till the end of time of like gigs that we've turned down that were high profile, of folks who wanted us to represent something that we don't represent. And so
of course,
I think bringing that into sort of an American, or sort of like that context of like, what is the purpose of an American choir? I would argue that different choirs have different purposes. Yes. So I think that's a key, right? Mm-hmm. And depending on who you bring, what the frame is, why people think they're coming, what community you're working in, what are the issues in that community, like there could be vastly different answers to the question that you asked.
Coming in at number 9 on the list is episode 96 with Braden Ayers. Real men, in quotes, sing? Well, yes, of course, I think real men sing, all the way from my macho, sportsiness that I bring into my classroom and talk about sports all the time, to other definitions of what it means to be a man. And I think that that is one of the best parts about the 21st century is that we are talking about these things. What does it mean to be a man? More openly and more fluently than we have before. Of course, in my generation, we were taught to never talk about our feelings. Well, we talk about our feelings now in 2022. And this episode, though, is really about the underlying physiological and psychological issues at play in the struggling art form of getting boys to want to sing. Check this one out. It's a really important episode. Yeah, another thing with sea shanties is they are short phrases. And that is very helpful for boys who, in puberty, where the vocal folds have doubled approximately in size within the last year or whatever, and it takes quite a bit of energy for them to just get the folds touching and moving, let alone to sing this long, 8-measure phrase that's got some looping melodic material or sustained. I'm doing Lauridsen's "Sure on This Shining Night," the TTBB right now. With my boys, but Now my younger boys, they can't do that by themselves. They for this project they're collaborating with the senior boys, and so
very good.
With their help they can do that, but by themselves they wouldn't be able to do that.
Sure.
And so there's a certain again. So I keep coming back to the vocal pedagogical aspect of it too, where there are unique, and of course this, but there are unique demands and unique needs for that male puberty voice that I think you're right.
Absolutely.
Figuring out things.
And I think frankly, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, just figuring out things that aren't sea shanties for that would be great.
Yeah. It's also documented in the research that part of the reason we fall back on some of this gender stuff is frankly because we don't have the expertise we need to really be addressing the vocal needs of these students, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because we as teachers, and this is not anyone's fault except for the fact that there's too much to cover in an undergrad music education degree already, right? There's only so many things that you can do, but we are not specialists unless we seek it out in the male changing voice. And it is a really difficult process. Students, whether, and it's hard for everyone because the boys who have grown up loving to sing, all of a sudden they feel like their voice is broken and they start to encounter issues of self-esteem and like, why am I even doing this? I'm bad at singing now. And, many boys quit and never come back, right? On the other hand, the boys who never learned how to sing, well, they don't get any training in their changing voice, and they literally never they never learn how to use it. And so you have these men walking around, grown adults, who have absolutely no concept of how to use their voice in any sort of musical way. So training boys how to work that transition, I think, is one of the best things that we can do. Because if we believe that singing is for all people and that all people should be singing, that shouldn't include, 25% of the boys in our country. It should be, everybody should be singing.
And at number 10 on the list was episode 104. This was Don't Abandon the Canon with Dr. Anika Prather. Dr. Prather is also an outside of choral music expert in literature, theater, and in education as well. She's an educator who specializes in preaching the gospel, so to speak, of classical literature and classical education as a tool for social justice and a tool for equity and a tool for inclusion. In many ways, we get presented the idea that classical means white. Classical is synonymous with white. Dr. Prather and I talk about the problems with that type of thinking and maybe why we should stop saying stuff like that. Specifically with classical literature, when someone says to me that that's a bunch of white people's ideas, I just tell them that they're historically illiterate, because the concept of being a white person didn't even exist then. Like that's a 1500s and 1600s idea that was invented to justify slavery. So I'm not taking on that idea. No, thank you very much.
Right.
So, and not to mention, I in fact, after the show, I'm going to send you a link because I had a conversation back before you and I met on Twitter on this show that you would probably really appreciate with Professor Kiros from Berkeley School of Music. He's their philosophy professor there. He's an Ethiopian professor.
Wow.
And he went off on this topic in a beautifully eloquent way to point out that even the ancient Greek philosophers and authors were borrowing ideas that they had learned from Ethiopian philosophers.
Yes. And they didn't mind sharing that.
Right. Especially because the concept of race didn't exist.
Right. Right. I mean, if you read the especially ancient Greece and Roman authors, they will tell you, I got this from the Egyptians, I got this from the Ethiopians. They will acknowledge that they're building on from that shared knowledge. And this is another thing that people don't understand. And it makes me sad that people think they are decolonizing it by taking classics, because what they're actually doing is they're taking a part of Black history. Okay. When they remove classics, when they remove the canon even from students of color, especially Black students, you are depriving them of something that connects them to their Black and African ancestors. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. You're not helping them.
Yes. You're
depriving them of their history. And I get really passionate about that. So let me calm down. Because that goes back to this myth that you're helping, but you're not. One of the things that people don't understand, I was sharing this with someone, I can't remember who it was recently, but one reason why classics, especially the texts of ancient Greece and Rome, were so important to the enslaved people, it was their only access to Africa. Because these ancient authors talked so openly about the Ethiopian empires and the Egyptian empires.
Thanks a lot, everybody. This has been a really, really fun year, and you do me the honor every single week that you tune in. I really appreciate it. The show is growing, the audience is growing, and I really hope that you will continue to tell your friends and participate, and I mean participate, in the conversation. Head over to Coralosopher's Facebook page. You can email at coralosophy@gmail.com. Of course, there's the Patreon page that you can jump on there and support. That's a huge deal. Patreon.com/Coralosophy. And last but not least, like, share, tell everybody you know at every convention you go to. Are you listening to Coralosophy? What are you doing? You're missing the conversation if you're not listening. Spread the word. That's really the bread and butter of this show. Happy New Year, everybody. It's, again, been a wonderful year. Thank you so much. See you in 2023.